Sarah Miller's weathered hands trembled slightly as she laced up her combat boots for what would become the most revealing day in Fort Riverside's 70-year history. At 47, she was old enough to be the mother of every other recruit in her basic training platoon, and they made sure she never forgot it. What none of them knew was that the woman they called Grandma Miller behind her back was actually Captain Elena Vasquez, the most decorated female sniper in U.S. Army history, operating under deep cover to investigate a conspiracy that went all the way to the Pentagon. In exactly 6 hours, when Drill Sergeant Kevin Thompson would be forced to use her real call sign during a live-fire exercise, the entire base would learn why some legends never truly retire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air at Fort Riverside carried the familiar scent of pine needles and diesel fuel, mixed with the acrid smell of gunpowder from the nearby shooting ranges. Sarah adjusted the straps of her rucksack as she approached the entrance to Building 247, the concrete structure that had been home to thousands of recruits over the decades. The building itself was unremarkable, typical military architecture designed for function over form, with narrow windows and a flat roof that spoke of efficiency rather than comfort. But for Sarah, this place represented something far more significant than just another training facility. She had arrived at Fort Riverside 6 weeks ago, carrying forged documentation that identified her as Sarah Miller, a 47-year-old divorced mother from rural Tennessee who had decided to enlist after her youngest child left for college. The backstory was carefully crafted by military intelligence, complete with a fabricated employment history at a small-town diner and a modest apartment that had been staged to look lived in for years. Every detail had been meticulously planned to create the perfect cover for what the Pentagon had classified as Operation Looking Glass, an investigation into irregularities in the military's equipment procurement process that had allegedly cost American lives. The woman walking through those barracks doors bore little resemblance to the legendary Captain Elena Vasquez who had once been featured on the cover of Military Times magazine. Gone was the confident bearing and the piercing gaze that had made her famous among special operations communities worldwide. In their place was a slightly stooped posture and the hesitant movements of someone who seemed overwhelmed by the demands of military life. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in the regulation style, but strands consistently escaped to frame a face that appeared worn down by years of hard living and disappointment. Sarah's appearance was so convincing that even she sometimes forgot who she really was underneath the carefully constructed persona. The transformation had been necessary not just for the mission, but for her own survival. 2 years earlier, Captain Elena Vasquez had disappeared from official records after discovering evidence of a massive fraud scheme involving Hamilton Defense Contractors, a private military company that had been selling defective equipment to the Army. When she had tried to report her findings through proper channels, she had been quietly transferred. Her security clearance had been suspended, and her military career had been effectively ended through what the Pentagon euphemistically called early retirement due to medical reasons. The irony was not lost on her that she was now back in the very system that had tried to silence her, hiding in plain sight among the newest recruits who represented the future of the institution she had once served with such distinction. These young men and women had no idea that the middle-aged woman struggling to keep up with their physical training had once held the record for the longest confirmed sniper kill in Afghanistan, or that she had been personally decorated by 3 different presidents for actions that remained classified to this day. As Sarah entered the barracks, the familiar sounds of military life surrounded her like an old song played in a different key. Boots clicked against polished floors. Voices carried the distinctive cadence of young people trying to sound more mature than their years, and underneath it all was the constant background noise of an institution that never truly slept. Footlockers slammed shut, bed frames creaked under the weight of perfectly made bunks, and somewhere in the distance, a drill sergeant's voice echoed through the corridors like thunder rolling across an open plain. Her bunk was located in the far corner of the bay, a position she had specifically requested during processing. From there, she could observe the social dynamics of her fellow recruits while maintaining the low profile that was essential to her mission. The other women in the platoon had initially tried to include her in their conversations and activities, but Sarah's deliberately awkward responses and apparent inability to keep up with their energy levels had gradually led them to treat her with the polite distance typically reserved for someone's embarrassing relative. The men in the platoon had been less kind. Led by Jake Matthews, a 22-year-old former college football player from Alabama, they had quickly established a hierarchy that placed Sarah firmly at the bottom. Matthews was everything that military recruiters look for in promotional materials: tall, athletic, confident, and possessed of the kind of natural leadership qualities that made other young men want to follow him. His blonde hair was cut in a perfect high-and-tight style, and his blue eyes held the kind of certainty that only came from a life where most challenges had been overcome through sheer physical ability and force of personality. Matthews had grown up in a military family, with a father who had served as a Marine drill instructor and a grandfather who had fought in Vietnam. Military service was not just an expectation in his household, it was a tradition that stretched back generations. He had enlisted immediately after college, turning down offers to try out for professional football teams because he believed that serving his country was a higher calling than pursuing personal glory on athletic fields. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His worldview was simple and straightforward. The military was about strength, discipline, and the willingness to sacrifice for something greater than yourself. People who could not meet those standards did not belong in uniform. From Matthews' perspective, Sarah Miller represented everything that was wrong with modern military recruitment policies. She was too old, too slow, and too weak to contribute meaningfully to unit effectiveness. During physical training sessions, she consistently finished last in every exercise, gasping for breath while younger recruits were barely winded. Her weapons handling was clumsy and uncertain, requiring constant correction from instructors who clearly found her presence frustrating. Most damning of all, she seemed to lack the aggressive spirit that Matthews believed was essential for anyone who might one day be called upon to close with and destroy the enemy. The morning of what would later be called the Fort Riverside incident began like any other training day. Reveille sounded at 0500 hours, followed by the controlled chaos of 36 recruits attempting to transform sleeping quarters into inspection-ready perfection within the allocated 15 minutes. Sarah moved through the routine with the mechanical precision of someone who had been doing it for weeks, but her movements still carried the slight hesitation of someone who was not entirely comfortable with the requirements. Matthews and his core group of followers had developed what they considered a harmless routine of commentary on Sarah's performance. As she struggled to fold her blankets to the exacting standards required by military regulations, Tyler Brooks, a 21-year-old former track star from Georgia, would make observations about the importance of attention to detail in combat situations. When she fell behind during formation movements, Connor Walsh, a 20-year-old from California who had enlisted after failing to find steady work in the tech industry, would wonder aloud whether some people were simply not cut out for military service. The comments were never directly addressed to Sarah, but they were always delivered with sufficient volume to ensure that she could hear them. Matthews justified this behavior to himself as a form of motivation, believing that social pressure might encourage Sarah to either improve her performance or voluntarily withdraw from training. In his mind, the military was no place for participation trophies or lowered standards. and anyone who could not handle a little criticism had no business wearing the uniform. What Matthews and his followers did not understand was that every comment, every smirk, and every dismissive gesture was being carefully catalogued by someone whose training in psychological operations had taught her to recognize and analyze group dynamics with scientific precision. Sarah's apparent sensitivity to their criticism was as much a part of her cover as her deliberately poor performance in training exercises. She had learned long ago that people revealed their true nature most clearly when they believed they held a position of advantage over someone they perceived as weak. The transformation from sleeping quarters to training uniform took place with the swift efficiency that characterized all military activities. Sarah pulled on the same digital camouflage pattern worn by every other recruit, but somehow the uniform seemed to hang differently on her frame. Where the younger soldiers wore their gear with the unconscious confidence of people who had grown up with video games and action movies, Sarah's equipment always appeared slightly awkward, as if she were wearing a costume that did not quite fit properly. Her weapon, a standard-issue M4 carbine, was slung across her shoulder with the casual familiarity that all soldiers developed after weeks of training. But even here there were subtle differences that only the most observant would notice. While other recruits gripped their rifles with the conscious attention of people still learning proper technique, Sarah's hands found their positions with an automaticity that suggested muscle memory developed over years rather than weeks. These small inconsistencies in her performance were carefully calculated to remain below the threshold of notice for casual observers while maintaining her cover identity. The march to the training ranges took the platoon through the heart of Fort Riverside, past administrative buildings and maintenance facilities that hummed with the constant activity of a major military installation. The base had been established during World War II and had served as a training ground for multiple generations of American soldiers. Its roads were lined with oak trees that had witnessed the transformation of civilians into warriors countless times, and its buildings bore the subtle modifications that accumulated over decades of adaptation to changing military requirements. Sarah walked in formation with her fellow recruits, but her eyes were constantly moving, cataloging details that others might miss. She noted the positions of security cameras, the patterns of vehicle traffic, and the locations of communications. Equipment with the practiced awareness of someone whose survival had once depended on such observations. This information was not immediately relevant to her current mission, but the habits of operational security were not easily abandoned, even when operating under deep cover within friendly territory. The Charlie Range complex where they were headed represented the culmination of weeks of basic marksmanship training. Unlike the simple paper targets and short distances that had characterized their earlier instruction, Charlie Range was designed to simulate realistic combat conditions with multiple target types, varying distances, and environmental challenges that would test every skill they had learned. For most of the recruits, this would be their first opportunity to demonstrate competency with their weapons under conditions that approximated real-world combat scenarios. For Sarah, the approaching exercise represented something far more dangerous than a simple training evolution. She knew that her deliberately poor performance during previous range sessions had established expectations among the training staff that would be difficult to maintain once live ammunition was involved. The muscle memory that she had spent years developing could not be completely suppressed, especially in high-stress situations where instinctive responses tended to override conscious control. She would need to balance the requirements of maintaining her cover with the basic safety considerations that prevented live-fire exercises from becoming casualty-producing events. As the platoon approached the range complex, the morning sun was beginning to burn off the light fog that had settled overnight in the low-lying areas between the training facilities. The air carried the sharp scent of cleaning solvent and gun oil from weapons that had been meticulously maintained according to military standards. mixed with the earthy smell of the berms and impact areas where thousands of rounds had been fired. Over the years, in the distance, the sound of other training exercises provided a constant background reminder. Charlie Range was just one small part of a much larger training operation that continued around the clock. The range itself was more sophisticated than anything most recruits had experienced during their civilian lives. Multiple firing lines were equipped with electronic scoring systems that could track individual shots with millimeter precision, while overhead cameras provided real-time feedback to instructors monitoring the exercise from a nearby control tower. Target arrays could be reconfigured remotely to present different challenges, and environmental conditions could be artificially modified through the use of smoke generators and audio systems that simulated battlefield noise. Sarah's hands moved automatically through the familiar routine of weapons preparation as Drill Sergeant Thompson began his pre-exercise briefing. Thompson was a career soldier with over 20 years of experience in training new recruits, and his weathered face reflected the accumulated wisdom of someone who had seen thousands of young Americans transform from civilians into soldiers. His voice carried the kind of authority that could cut through nervous chatter and focus attention on essential details. But Sarah noticed something else in his tone when his eyes briefly met hers during the briefing. Thompson knew exactly who she was. The realization hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow, though she was careful not to let any change in her expression reveal her understanding. Thompson's knowledge of her true identity meant that her mission had been compromised from the beginning, or alternatively, that her cover was so deep that even the training staff had been brought into the operation. Either possibility carried implications that would need to be carefully analyzed once the immediate situation was resolved. The weapons familiarization that followed. Thompson's briefing proceeded according to the standard script that Sarah had observed during previous training sessions. Recruits were called forward individually to demonstrate their understanding of basic marksmanship principles, while their peers observed and learned from both successes and failures. Matthews and his core group performed with the competence that their backgrounds had led everyone to expect, achieving scores that placed them well within acceptable ranges for soldiers at their level of training. When Sarah's turn came, she approached the firing line with the same hesitant uncertainty that had characterized all of her previous performances. Her grip on the rifle appeared awkward, her stance seemed uncomfortable, and her breathing pattern suggested someone struggling to remember lessons that had been taught weeks earlier. The first few shots impacted the target in patterns that indicated a shooter who understood the basic principles but lacked the experience to apply them consistently under pressure. But even as Sarah deliberately degraded her performance to maintain her cover identity, she could feel the familiar rhythm of precision shooting beginning to assert itself. The weight of the rifle in her hands, the resistance of the trigger, and the relationship between sight picture and point of impact were all elements of a complex equation that her body had solved thousands of times before. Suppressing those responses required constant conscious effort, like trying to write with the wrong hand or speak in an unfamiliar accent. Matthews watched Sarah's performance with the satisfaction of someone whose prejudices were being confirmed by observable evidence. Her shooting was exactly what he had expected from someone who clearly did not belong in military training: inconsistent, uncertain, and ultimately inadequate for the demands of combat operations. When she managed to achieve a reasonable group of shots, he attributed it to chance rather than skill, and when she missed the target entirely, he saw it as confirmation of his assessment of her capabilities. The morning progressed through increasingly complex exercises designed to evaluate different aspects of marksmanship skills under varying conditions. Recruits fired from multiple positions, engaged targets at different distances, and demonstrated their ability to adapt to changing tactical scenarios. Throughout each evolution, Sarah maintained her carefully constructed persona of someone struggling to meet minimum standards while occasionally showing flashes of competence that could be attributed to luck or momentary concentration. But the real test was still to come, and as the morning wore on, Sarah could see Drill Sergeant Thompson preparing for the exercise that would ultimately determine whether her cover could be maintained, or whether the mission that had brought her to Fort Riverside would be exposed in the most dramatic way possible. The advanced marksmanship evaluation that concluded each range session was designed to push recruits to the limits of their abilities while providing training staff with definitive assessments of their potential for more specialized roles within the military structure. As Thompson called for the final exercise to begin, Sarah felt the familiar pre-combat calm that had sustained her through countless dangerous situations beginning to settle over her consciousness. In a few minutes, she would be forced to choose between maintaining her cover and preventing a training accident that could cost lives. Either choice would have consequences that extended far beyond the boundaries of Fort Riverside, and she was rapidly running out of time to find a third option that might allow her to accomplish both objectives simultaneously. Charlie Range stretched across 47 acres of meticulously maintained North Carolina countryside, its design reflecting decades of evolution in military training methodology. The facility represented the pinnacle of modern marksmanship. Instruction with computer-controlled target systems, capable of simulating everything from static precision shooting to dynamic combat scenarios. Digital displays mounted throughout the complex provided real-time feedback on wind conditions, humidity levels, and atmospheric pressure, while underground cables carried data streams that could track every round fired with forensic precision. The main observation tower rose 30 feet above the firing line, its reinforced windows providing instructors with commanding views of all active ranges while sophisticated audio systems allowed them to monitor and direct training exercises with surgical precision. Below the tower, climate-controlled equipment rooms housed servers that could analyze shooting patterns, identify individual shooter characteristics, and generate detailed performance reports that became permanent parts of each recruit's military record. Every aspect of the facility spoke to the military's commitment to producing marksmen who could perform under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Sarah found herself genuinely impressed by the technological sophistication surrounding her, though she was careful not to let that appreciation show in her demeanor. During her years of active service, she had trained on facilities that were considered state-of-the-art at the time, but the advances in training technology during her absence from military life were remarkable. Electronic scoring systems that once required dedicated technicians could now be operated by individual instructors, while ballistic computers that had once filled entire rooms were now integrated into compact tablets that could calculate firing solutions in real time. The cost of maintaining such a facility was staggering, with each electronic target system representing an investment equivalent to a luxury automobile and the computer infrastructure rivaling that of major corporations. Federal budget allocations for military training had increased substantially in recent years, driven by lessons learned in Iraq and Afghanistan about the critical importance of superior marksmanship in modern warfare. Every recruit who passed through Charlie Range represented a significant investment in America's future military capabilities, making the quality of instruction they received a matter of national strategic importance. As the platoon moved through their equipment inspection, Sarah observed the careful choreography that characterized all military training operations. Each recruit was responsible for specific gear configurations that had been refined through decades of combat experience, from the way ammunition pouches were arranged on load-bearing equipment to the precise positioning of backup iron sights on their rifles. These seemingly minor details could mean the difference between life and death in actual combat situations, making their mastery essential rather than optional. The other recruits around her represented a cross-section of American society that reflected both the opportunities and challenges facing military recruitment in the 21st century. Amy Foster, a 19-year-old from rural Iowa, had enlisted to escape the limited economic prospects of her farming community while pursuing her dream of becoming a military police officer. Her earnest dedication to mastering every aspect of military life was evident in the way she approached each training exercise, asking thoughtful questions and taking detailed notes that she reviewed during whatever free time was available. Foster had quickly emerged as the most promising female recruit in the platoon, combining natural athletic ability with the kind of fierce determination that instructors recognized as predictive of long-term success. Her background growing up on a family farm had given her familiarity with firearms and outdoor environments that proved advantageous during field training exercises, while her small-town upbringing had instilled values of hard work and personal responsibility that aligned perfectly with military culture. Sarah had watched Foster's progress with interest, recognizing in the younger woman some of the same qualities that had once driven her own military career. The male recruits presented a more diverse range of backgrounds and motivations, reflecting the complex factors that led young Americans to choose military service in an era when such service was entirely voluntary. Connor Walsh had grown up in affluent suburbs of San Francisco, where military service was rarely discussed as a viable career option, but economic pressures following his graduation from college had made military benefits increasingly attractive. His technical background in computer programming was already being noted by instructors, who saw potential for specialized training in cybersecurity or intelligence operations. Mason Rodriguez brought a different perspective shaped by his family's long history of military service and his experience working construction jobs that had given him practical skills in problem solving and physical labor. At 23, he was among the older recruits in the platoon, and his maturity showed in the way he approached training challenges with methodical patience, rather than the impulsive energy that characterized some of his younger peers. Rodriguez had initially been skeptical about the inclusion of women in combat roles, but weeks of observing Foster's performance had begun to modify his views on gender integration in military units. Tyler Brooks represented the stereotype of military recruiting success stories, a former collegiate athlete whose combination of physical ability and competitive drive seemed ideally suited for military service. His background as a track and field competitor had given him advantages in physical training that were immediately apparent to both instructors and fellow recruits. Brooks possessed the kind of natural leadership qualities that often led to rapid promotion in military hierarchies, though his tendency toward impatience with slower learners sometimes created friction during group training exercises. The equipment distributed to each recruit represented millions of dollars in research and development costs, with every component designed to maximize effectiveness while minimizing weight and complexity. Modern military rifles incorporated technological advances that would have seemed like science fiction to previous generations of soldiers, from electronic optics that could automatically compensate for environmental conditions to modular designs that allowed rapid reconfiguration for different mission requirements. Even basic items like ammunition pouches and protective gear reflected sophisticated engineering intended to give American forces decisive advantages in combat situations. Sarah's handling of her assigned equipment required constant conscious effort to maintain the appearance of unfamiliarity that her cover identity demanded. The weight distribution of a properly configured load-bearing system was something her body remembered with the clarity of muscle memory developed over years of operational deployment. But she forced herself to make the minor adjustments and complaints that would be expected from someone encountering military gear for the first time. These small details of performance were essential to maintaining her cover, even though they felt fundamentally wrong to someone who had once been considered among the most professionally competent soldiers in the Army. The morning briefing conducted by Drill Sergeant Thompson followed standard protocols that had been refined through decades of training experience, but Sarah detected subtle variations that suggested this particular exercise would involve elements not typically included in basic recruit training. Thompson's emphasis on safety procedures was more detailed than usual, and his discussion of emergency protocols included references to scenarios that seemed disproportionately complex for the level of training being conducted. These indicators suggested that the day's activities would include challenges designed to push recruits beyond their comfort zones in ways that would reveal their true potential under stress. Thompson himself represented the best traditions of the non-commissioned officer corps that formed the backbone of military effectiveness. His 23 years of service had included deployments to every major conflict zone of the past 2 decades, and his experienced training recruits had given him an almost supernatural ability to assess individual potential within days of initial contact. The decorations on his uniform told stories of personal courage and professional competence that had earned him the respect of both subordinates and superiors throughout his career. As Thompson explained the day's training objectives, Sarah found herself studying his body language for additional clues about what he might know regarding her true identity. His occasional glances in her direction seemed to carry meaning beyond simple instructor awareness of individual recruit progress, and his tone when addressing safety concerns suggested someone who understood that the margin for error might be smaller than usual. These subtle indicators reinforced her growing certainty that her cover had been compromised, though the extent and implications of that compromise remained unclear. The competitive atmosphere among the recruits had been building throughout their weeks of training, with informal hierarchies emerging based on performance and various military skills. Matthews had established himself as the undisputed leader among the male recruits, combining superior physical performance with the kind of natural charisma that made others want to follow his example. His confidence in his own abilities was evident in everything from his posture during formation activities to his willingness to volunteer for challenging assignments that might intimidate less experienced soldiers. Matthews had grown up in a military culture where excellence was expected rather than celebrated, and his standards for acceptable performance reflected that background. His father's career as a Marine drill instructor had exposed him to the highest levels of military professionalism from an early age, while his grandfather's stories of combat in Vietnam had instilled deep respect for the traditions and values that define military service. From Matthews' perspective, the military was not simply a job or career choice, but a calling that demanded total commitment and unwavering dedication to excellence. The dynamic between Matthews and his closest followers had evolved into something resembling a military unit in miniature, with informal roles and responsibilities that mirrored the structure they were learning to function within as professional soldiers. Brooks served as Matthews' primary lieutenant, using his athletic background to help motivate and train other recruits who struggled with physical challenges. Walsh provided technical expertise that was increasingly valuable as training exercises incorporated more sophisticated equipment and digital systems. Rodriguez brought practical experience and maturity that helped the group navigate challenges that required patience and methodical problem-solving. Sarah's position within this social structure was clearly defined as an outsider whose presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. The other recruits had initially attempted to include her in group activities and informal discussions, but her deliberately awkward responses and apparent inability to contribute meaningfully to collective efforts had gradually led to her isolation. This social dynamic was exactly what she had intended to achieve, as it allowed her to observe group behavior without being expected to participate actively in ways that might compromise her cover identity. The exclusion she experienced was not actively malicious, but rather reflected the natural tendency of military units to develop cohesion around shared competence and mutual respect. Sarah's poor performance in training exercises had marked her as someone who might not be reliable in combat situations, making her integration into the informal social network both difficult and potentially counterproductive. From the group's perspective, This isolation was professionally useful for her mission objectives, but it also served as a constant reminder of how completely she had suppressed the identity that had once made her one of the most respected soldiers in the Army. The mornings. Activities began with individual equipment inspections that were designed to reinforce attention to detail while identifying recruits who might require additional instruction in basic military procedures. Each recruit was expected to present their gear in precise configurations that demonstrated both technical competence and understanding of the reasoning behind specific requirements. The inspection process was methodical and thorough, with instructors using the opportunity to assess both technical knowledge and the mental discipline required for reliable performance under stress. Sarah approached her inspection with the same careful preparation that characterized all aspects of her cover performance, ensuring that her equipment met minimum standards while displaying the kind of minor errors that would be expected from someone still learning military procedures. Her rifle cleaning was adequate but not exceptional. Her ammunition organization was functional but not optimized, and her protective gear was properly configured but showed evidence of uncertainty about some technical details. These carefully calculated imperfections were essential to maintaining the impression of marginal competence that her cover identity required. The transition from individual preparation to group formation marked the beginning of the day's primary training evolution, with the platoon moving through a series of exercises designed to build confidence and competence in basic marksmanship skills. The progression was carefully structured to provide multiple opportunities for success, while gradually increasing the complexity of challenges that recruits would face. This approach reflected decades of experience in training methodology, balancing the need to build confidence with the equally important requirement to identify and address individual weaknesses before they became dangerous liabilities. As the platoon moved through their preliminary exercises, Sarah found herself increasingly impressed by the professionalism and competence of her fellow recruits. Despite their youth and inexperience, they demonstrated the kind of dedication and attention to detail that suggested they would develop into effective soldiers given proper training and leadership. Their willingness to help each other overcome individual challenges reflected the kind of unit cohesion that was essential for effectiveness in combat situations, even though some of that cooperation did not extend to her because of her apparent inability to contribute meaningfully to collective success. The shooting positions that formed the foundation of military marksmanship training required physical strength and flexibility that challenged even the most athletic recruits, combining elements of endurance, stability, and fine motor control in ways that were difficult to master without extensive practice. The prone position demanded the ability to maintain steady aim while supporting body weight on elbows and forearms for extended periods. The kneeling position required balance and core strength while managing the complex geometry of sight alignment and trigger control. The standing position presented the greatest challenge to accuracy by requiring shooters to achieve stability without external support while managing the effects of natural body movement on precision. Sarah's performance in each position was carefully calibrated to demonstrate basic competence while avoiding the kind of exceptional proficiency that would raise questions about her background. Her prone shooting showed reasonable accuracy with groups that were acceptable but not remarkable. Her kneeling position revealed occasional flashes of better performance that could be attributed to momentary concentration rather than systematic skill. Her standing position was deliberately inconsistent, reflecting the genuine difficulty that most recruits experienced when attempting to achieve precision without stable support. The psychological pressure of performing under observation added another layer of complexity to the training exercise, as recruits were aware that their individual performance was being evaluated not only by instructors, but also by their peers. This awareness could either motivate superior performance or create anxiety that degraded shooting accuracy. depending on individual personality traits and previous experience with high-pressure situations. The ability to perform effectively under observation was itself an important military skill, as combat operations invariably involved situations where individual performance had implications for unit survival and mission success. Matthews approached each shooting position with the confident competence that had characterized his performance throughout basic training, achieving scores that consistently placed him among the top performers in the platoon. His shooting technique reflected both natural ability and the benefits of previous experience with firearms through hunting and recreational shooting during his civilian life. More importantly, his performance under observation demonstrated the kind of mental toughness that military leaders looked for when identifying recruits with potential for more demanding roles in special operations or leadership positions. The contrast between Matthews' confident proficiency and Sarah's apparently struggling performance was stark enough to draw comments from other recruits who were observing the exercise. Brooks made observations about the importance of physical fitness in achieving shooting accuracy, noting that proper positioning required strength and endurance that might be challenging for older recruits. Walsh documented the exercise on his personal device, capturing footage that he planned to share with family and friends as evidence of his military training experience. Rodriguez focused on the technical aspects of marksmanship instruction, taking notes that he hoped would help him improve his own performance in future exercises. The atmosphere of mutual support and encouragement that characterized most platoon activities noticeably diminished when Sarah's turn came to demonstrate her shooting abilities. The other recruits watched with polite attention rather than the enthusiastic interest they showed for their peers, reflecting their assessment of her as someone whose performance was unlikely to provide useful examples for their own improvement. This social dynamic was painful for Sarah to experience, even though she understood that it was both necessary for her mission and entirely predictable given her deliberately poor performance in previous training exercises. Foster was the only recruit who consistently offered encouragement and practical assistance to Sarah during training exercises, reflecting both her personal character and her understanding that unit effectiveness depended on bringing every member up to acceptable standards rather than simply celebrating individual excellence. Foster's support was genuine and helpful, making Sarah's deception feel particularly uncomfortable because it involved deceiving someone whose kindness and professionalism were entirely undeserved. This emotional complexity was one of the unexpected challenges of undercover operations that training had not fully prepared her to handle. The progression through different shooting positions provided opportunities for incremental improvement that most recruits were able to achieve through focused effort and attention to instructor feedback. The immediate feedback provided by electronic scoring systems allowed shooters to make rapid adjustments to their technique, while the effects of previous shots were still fresh in their memory. This accelerated learning process was one of the significant advantages of modern training facilities over the more primitive ranges that had been used for military training in previous decades. Sarah's familiarity with advanced marksmanship techniques made it difficult to avoid unconscious improvements in her shooting performance as the exercise progressed. The muscle memory developed through thousands of hours of practice had a tendency to assert itself despite her conscious efforts to maintain the appearance of marginal competence. She found herself making subtle adjustments to her shooting position that improved stability and accuracy before catching herself and deliberately introducing errors that would restore the impression of someone still learning basic techniques. The internal conflict between her professional instincts and her mission requirements created a constant source of tension that required careful management to avoid compromising her cover identity. Every shot represented a choice between demonstrating her true capabilities and maintaining the deception that was essential to her investigation. The psychological strain of constantly suppressing her natural responses was more exhausting than the physical demands of the training exercise itself, requiring a level of mental discipline that few people outside the intelligence community would be able to understand or appreciate. As the morning progressed toward the more challenging exercises that would conclude the training session, Sarah could sense the increasing attention that Drill Sergeant Thompson was paying to her performance. His knowledge of her true identity created additional complexity in an already difficult situation, as she was uncertain whether his observations were intended to protect her cover or to evaluate her ability to maintain the deception under pressure. The possibility that her mission had been compromised from the beginning was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, though the implications of such a compromise remained unclear. The final phase of the morning's training would involve exercises that pushed recruits to the limits of their current abilities while providing instructors with definitive assessments of their potential for more advanced training. These exercises were designed to create controlled stress that would reveal how individuals performed when their basic competence was challenged by increasing complexity and pressure. For most recruits, this would be their first real test of their ability to apply everything they had learned under conditions that approximated the stress of actual combat operations. For Sarah, the approaching exercises represented a critical decision point where she would need to choose between maintaining her cover and potentially allowing a dangerous situation to develop that could put other recruits at risk. Her years of experience had taught her to recognize the warning signs that indicated when training exercises were approaching the threshold where safety margins became critically important. The combination of live ammunition, complex scenarios, and recruit stress levels created conditions where small errors could rapidly escalate into serious accidents, if not properly managed by experienced supervision. The weight of responsibility she felt toward her fellow recruits was complicated by the knowledge that revealing her true capabilities would compromise an investigation that could have implications far beyond the boundaries of Fort Riverside. The evidence she was gathering about equipment procurement fraud had the potential to save lives and prevent the kind of institutional corruption that had cost American soldiers their lives in previous conflicts. Balancing those larger considerations against the immediate safety concerns of a training exercise required the kind of moral calculation that had no clear or easy answers. As Thompson called for the final exercise to begin, Sarah felt the familiar calm that had sustained her through countless dangerous situations beginning to settle over her consciousness. In a few minutes, she would discover whether the careful balance she had maintained between her cover identity and her professional responsibilities could survive the kind of high-stress situation that had a tendency to strip away pretense and reveal people's true nature. The outcome would determine not only the success of her mission, but also whether the legend of Captain Elena Vasquez would remain buried or emerge in the most dramatic way possible. The Advanced Combat Marksmanship Assessment represented the culmination of 6 weeks of intensive training, designed to evaluate each recruit's readiness for progression to specialized military occupational specialties that required superior shooting skills. The exercise format had been developed through extensive analysis of combat performance data from Iraq and Afghanistan, incorporating lessons learned about the specific marksmanship challenges that soldiers faced in modern warfare environments. Unlike the static shooting exercises that had characterized earlier training, this assessment would require recruits to engage multiple target types at varying distances while managing time, pressure, and environmental stressors that simulated battlefield conditions. Thompson's briefing emphasized the significance of the assessment, not only for individual career progression, but also for unit assignment decisions that would determine where each recruit would serve during their initial tours of duty. High scores could lead to opportunities for sniper training, special operations consideration, or assignment to elite units where superior marksmanship was essential for mission success. Conversely, poor performance might result in assignment to support roles where shooting skills were less critical, effectively limiting career advancement opportunities within combat specialties that many recruits aspired to enter. The scoring system incorporated multiple factors beyond simple accuracy, including target engagement speed, ability to transition between different shooting positions, and performance under simulated stress conditions. Each recruit would face a sequence of increasingly difficult challenges designed to identify their maximum capability under pressure. The exercise began with standard precision shooting at known distances, progressed through rapid engagement, scenarios that tested speed and accuracy combinations, and concluded with complex problem-solving situations that required tactical thinking as well as technical shooting skills. Sarah approached the firing line with the same apparent uncertainty that had characterized her performance throughout basic training. But internally she was calculating the precise balance required to maintain her cover while avoiding safety violations that could endanger other participants. The scoring thresholds for passing the assessment were well within her capabilities, even while maintaining her deliberately degraded performance level. But the advanced portions of the exercise would require split-second decisions about how much competence she could safely demonstrate without arousing suspicion about her true background. Matthews stepped forward as the first shooter with the confident stride of someone who had never doubted his ability to excel at any challenge the military could present. His rifle was configured with the precision that reflected weeks of careful attention to equipment maintenance and optimization. Every accessory was positioned for maximum efficiency. Every adjustment had been fine-tuned to match his individual shooting characteristics, and his preparation routine demonstrated the methodical approach that distinguished serious marksmen from casual shooters. The first stage of the assessment required precision engagement of targets at distances ranging from 100 to 400 meters, with scoring based on group size and center accuracy rather than simply hitting the target area. Matthews settled into his shooting position with fluid efficiency, his breathing pattern automatically adjusting to the rhythm that optimized his accuracy potential. His first string of shots produced a group that could be covered by a quarter, demonstrating the kind of precision that instructors associated with recruits who had significant potential for advanced marksmanship training. The electronic scoring system immediately displayed Matthews' results on monitors visible to all participants, showing numerical scores that placed him well above the threshold for expert qualification. The consistency of his performance across multiple target engagements indicated not just good shooting, but the kind of repeatable precision that was essential for military applications, where first-round hits could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. His facial expression reflected satisfaction rather than surprise, as if the results simply confirmed what he had expected to achieve. Brooks followed with a performance that was nearly as impressive, though his technique showed subtle differences. That reflected his background in competitive athletics rather than traditional marksmanship training. His approach to shooting emphasized speed and consistency over absolute precision, achieving results that would be highly effective in combat situations, even if they fell slightly short of the mechanical accuracy that Matthews had demonstrated. The competitive drive that had made him successful in track and field translated effectively to military shooting, where mental toughness and performance under pressure were often more important than perfect technique. Walsh surprised many observers by achieving scores that exceeded expectations based on his previous training performance, demonstrating the benefits of his analytical approach to mastering technical skills. His background in computer programming had given him advantages in understanding the systematic aspects of marksmanship, from ballistic calculations to equipment optimization, that allowed him to achieve consistent results despite having less natural athletic ability than some of his peers. His success illustrated the military's growing recognition that intellectual capabilities could compensate for physical limitations in many modern combat specialties. Rodriguez brought a different style to the exercise, emphasizing reliability. and steady performance over spectacular individual shots. His construction background had given him comfort with precision tools and attention to detail that translated well to military shooting requirements. While his scores were not the highest in the group, his consistency across different shooting positions and target types indicated the kind of dependable performance that unit commanders valued when making assignment decisions for positions where steady competence was more important than exceptional ability. Foster's performance drew particular attention from instructors who were evaluating the effectiveness of gender integration in combat training programs. Her scores were competitive with the best male shooters in the platoon, but more importantly, her technique demonstrated the kind of fundamental understanding of marksmanship principles that predicted continued improvement with additional training and experience. Her success was particularly significant given the ongoing debates within military leadership about the physical standards and capabilities required for various combat specialties. When Sarah's turn came to demonstrate her abilities, the atmosphere among the other recruits was noticeably different from the attention and encouragement that had characterized previous performances. The pattern of marginal competence that she had established during weeks of training had created expectations that this exercise would simply confirm her unsuitability for roles requiring superior marksmanship skills. Matthews and his followers watched with the detached interest of people observing someone who was about to confirm their preconceived assessments rather than challenge them. Sarah's approach to the firing line carried none of the confident efficiency that had characterized the previous shooters, but rather the hesitant movements of someone who was uncertain about their ability to meet the standards being demanded. Her rifle handling appeared awkward and uncertain, requiring visible concentration to accomplish tasks that other recruits had performed automatically. Her shooting position looked uncomfortable and unstable, suggesting someone who had not yet developed the muscle memory that came with extensive practice and proper instruction. The first target array consisted of standard precision targets at 200 meters, requiring 5 shots to be fired within a specified time limit with scoring based on group size and accuracy relative to the point of aim. Sarah's initial shots impacted the target in a pattern that suggested basic competence combined with the kind of inconsistency that was typical of shooters who understood the fundamentals but lacked the experience to apply them reliably under pressure. Her first shot hit the 7 ring, followed by shots in the 8 and 9 rings that indicated gradual improvement as she settled into the exercise. But something was happening that only the most observant watchers might have noticed. Despite the apparent awkwardness of her shooting position and the visible uncertainty in her movements, Sarah's shots were beginning to group with a consistency that was subtly superior to what her technique seemed capable of producing. The pattern of impact suggested a shooter whose fundamental understanding of marksmanship was more sophisticated than her visible performance indicated, though the overall results remained within the range that could be explained by focused concentration and elementary competence. Thompson watched Sarah's performance with particular intensity, his expression carefully neutral, but his attention clearly focused on details that other observers might miss. His years of experience training recruits had given him the ability to recognize when performance didn't quite match apparent skill level, and Sarah's shooting was beginning to display characteristics that didn't align perfectly with the struggling recruit persona she had maintained throughout basic training. The discrepancy was subtle enough to avoid detection by casual observers, but significant enough to raise questions in the mind of someone who knew what to look for. The second stage of the assessment increased the complexity significantly, requiring shooters to engage multiple targets at different distances, while transitioning between shooting positions, according to instructions delivered through their headsets. This portion of the exercise was designed to evaluate not just shooting accuracy, but also the ability to process information and execute complex tasks under time pressure. The scenarios simulated the kind of dynamic situations that soldiers might Encounter and combat operations where static shooting positions were not available and rapid adaptation was essential for survival. Matthews tackled the complex shooting scenarios with the same systematic approach that had characterized his earlier performance, achieving transition times and accuracy levels that placed him among the top performers in the assessment. His ability to maintain precision while moving between positions demonstrated the kind of overall physical coordination that military leaders associated with potential for elite unit assignment. More importantly, his performance under the increased stress of complex requirements showed the mental resilience that was essential for effectiveness in high-pressure combat situations. Sarah's performance in the complex scenarios required increasingly careful management to maintain her cover while meeting safety requirements that became more critical as the exercise difficulty increased. The transition between shooting positions created opportunities for her natural competence to assert itself in ways that were difficult to consciously suppress. Her body wanted to move with the fluid efficiency that came from years of tactical training, while her cover identity demanded the awkward uncertainty of someone learning these skills for the first time. The internal conflict between her professional instincts and her mission requirements created a constant source of tension that manifested in subtle inconsistencies in her performance. Her movement between positions occasionally displayed glimpses of tactical proficiency that were quickly suppressed in favor of the clumsy adjustments that would be expected from an inexperienced recruit. Her target engagement sometimes showed flashes of superior technique that had to be deliberately degraded to maintain the appearance of basic competence struggling under pressure. The third stage introduced environmental stressors designed to simulate battlefield conditions that could degrade shooting performance through physical and psychological pressure. Smoke generators created visibility limitations that required shooters to adapt their techniques for engaging targets under less than ideal conditions. Audio systems generated realistic battle sounds that tested the ability to maintain concentration while processing competing sensory inputs. Time pressure was increased to levels that approached the decision-making speeds required in actual combat operations. The combination of environmental stressors and technical challenges created conditions where the margin between success and failure became extremely narrow, requiring shooters to demonstrate not just mechanical accuracy, but also the kind of mental toughness that distinguished effective combat soldiers from those who might struggle under operational pressure. For most recruits, this portion of the assessment represented their first exposure to training conditions that approximated the stress levels they would encounter during actual military operations. Matthews' performance under simulated battlefield conditions confirmed his suitability for roles requiring superior marksmanship under pressure, though even he showed some degradation in precision as the environmental stressors increased. His ability to maintain acceptable accuracy, despite the challenging conditions, demonstrated exactly the kind of performance that military planners expected from soldiers who might be called upon to engage enemy forces at long range under less than ideal circumstances. His scores remained well above minimum thresholds, but the visible effort required to achieve those results provided insight into his performance envelope under stress. For Sarah, the environmental stressors created both opportunities and dangers for maintaining her cover identity. The reduced visibility and increased noise levels made it easier to conceal the subtle indicators of superior competence that might otherwise be noticed by careful observers. However, the increased stress also made it more difficult to maintain conscious control over the automatic responses that her body had been trained to execute under exactly these kinds of conditions. The smoke and noise triggered sensory memories of actual combat operations where her survival had depended on the kind of instant, precise responses that she was now trying to suppress. Her nervous system wanted to shift into the heightened awareness state that had kept her alive through countless dangerous situations, while her conscious mind struggled to maintain the performance level consistent with her cover identity. The psychological effort required to fight against her own training was more exhausting than the physical demands of the exercise itself. As the complexity of the scenarios continued to increase, Sarah found herself approaching a critical decision point where maintaining her cover might become incompatible with ensuring the safety of other participants. The exercise was designed to push recruits to their limits, but the safety margins depended on the assumption that all participants were performing at their maximum capability level. If someone was deliberately restricting their performance while others were operating at their limits, the result could be dangerous situations that the exercise supervisors were not prepared to manage. The fourth stage of the assessment introduced the most challenging scenarios that basic training recruits would encounter, requiring rapid decision-making combined with precision shooting under conditions that closely approximated combat operations. Target arrays included both legitimate military targets and civilian representations that required shooters to make split-second identification decisions while maintaining accuracy under time pressure. The scenarios were designed to evaluate not just technical shooting skills but also the judgment and decision-making capabilities that were essential for soldiers who might be deployed in complex operational environments. These advanced scenarios pushed several recruits beyond their current capability levels, resulting in performance degradation that was both expected and valuable for assessment purposes. The point where individual performance began to break down under pressure provided instructors with critical information about each recruit's suitability for different types of military assignments. Some recruits maintained basic competence but lost the precision required for specialized roles, while others showed dramatic performance degradation that indicated unsuitability for any combat specialty requiring marksmanship skills. Foster's performance in the advanced scenarios was particularly noteworthy, as she maintained both accuracy and decision-making quality despite the increased pressure and complexity. Her ability to correctly identify targets while maintaining precision under time pressure demonstrated exactly the kind of capability that military leaders were looking for when evaluating candidates for roles that might involve operations in civilian environments where target identification was critical for preventing unacceptable casualties. Matthews continued to excel in the advanced scenarios, though the visible effort required to maintain his performance levels provided insight into his operational limits under stress. His scores remained consistently high, but the increased concentration required to achieve those results suggested that he was approaching the threshold where further stress might begin to degrade his effectiveness. This information was valuable for determining appropriate assignment and training progression that would continue to challenge him without exceeding his current capabilities. The complexity of the advanced scenarios created exactly the kind of high-stress environment where Sarah's natural responses were most difficult to suppress. The target identification requirements triggered tactical decision-making processes that her brain had been trained to execute automatically, while the time pressure demanded the kind of instant, precise responses that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of operational training. Maintaining her cover under these conditions required a level of conscious self-control that was approaching the limits of what was psychologically sustainable. The critical moment came during a scenario that required engaging multiple targets in rapid sequence while transitioning between different shooting positions under simulated incoming fire. The exercise was designed to test the absolute limits of recruit capabilities while maintaining safety margins that prevented dangerous situations from developing. However, the combination of complexity and stress created conditions where small errors could rapidly escalate into serious problems, if not immediately corrected by experienced intervention. One of the recruits, Walsh, became disoriented during the complex transition sequence and began to turn toward other participants while still holding his loaded rifle in a position that violated fundamental safety protocols. The situation developed so quickly that even experienced instructors needed several seconds to recognize the danger and begin corrective action. In those critical seconds, someone with split-second tactical decision-making capabilities would need to intervene to prevent what could become a catastrophic training accident. Sarah saw the developing situation with the clarity that came from years of training, specifically designed to recognize and respond to exactly these kinds of emergencies. Her tactical awareness automatically assessed the angles of fire, the positions of all personnel in the area, and the fastest methods for safely resolving the dangerous situation before anyone could be injured. Every instinct developed through her military career demanded immediate action to protect her fellow soldiers from harm. The choice she faced was immediate and stark: maintain her cover identity while hoping that the instructors could resolve the situation before anyone was hurt, or reveal her true capabilities by taking the kind of instant, decisive action that would certainly expose her identity but might prevent serious injuries or deaths. The decision had to be made in milliseconds, with no time for careful consideration of the mission implications or long-term consequences. In that instant, Sarah's priorities crystallized with absolute clarity. The mission that had brought her to Fort Riverside was important, but it could not justify allowing fellow soldiers to be injured or killed when she had the capability to prevent such an outcome. The investigation into equipment procurement fraud would have to find other methods of gathering evidence, because she could not live with the knowledge that she had chosen mission security over the lives of the people she was sworn to protect. The transformation from Sarah Miller to Captain Elena Vasquez happened with a speed that defied conscious observation. Her rifle came up with mechanical precision. Her body moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times under actual combat conditions, and her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed instantly and without question. The awkward, uncertain recruit disappeared completely, replaced by someone whose every movement radiated lethal competence and absolute professional confidence. Her intervention was surgical in its precision and devastating in its implications. For her cover identity, she disabled the dangerous situation with a series of actions that were so perfectly executed and professionally competent that every observer immediately understood they were witnessing someone whose capabilities far exceeded anything that basic military training could produce. The speed and precision of her response left no doubt that she possessed the kind of advanced tactical training that was reserved for the most elite levels of military service. The immediate aftermath of her intervention was characterized by a silence so complete that it seemed to absorb even the ambient sounds of the training facility. Every person present understood that they had just witnessed something extraordinary, though the full implications of what they had seen would take time to process. The woman who had been dismissed as an aging recruit struggling to meet minimum standards had just demonstrated capabilities that exceeded those of seasoned combat veterans. Thompson's reaction was immediate and telling, as his facial expression shifted from concern about the safety situation to recognition of what Sarah's intervention meant for her cover identity and the larger mission that had brought her to Fort Riverside. His knowledge of her true identity allowed him to understand immediately that the careful balance between operational security and mission effectiveness had just been irrevocably altered by circumstances that no one could have anticipated or controlled. Matthews and his followers stood frozen in a state of shock that reflected their complete inability to process what they had just witnessed. The woman they had been mocking and dismissing for weeks had just displayed a level of professional competence that made their own accomplishments seem insignificant by comparison. The confidence and superiority that had characterized their attitude toward her was replaced by a growing awareness that they had been making judgments based on incomplete and fundamentally incorrect information. As the immediate safety concerns were resolved and normal training activities could resume, the fundamental dynamics of the entire exercise had been permanently altered. Sarah's cover identity lay in ruins. Her mission security had been compromised beyond repair, And every person present now understood that the quiet, struggling recruit they had known was actually someone whose true capabilities and background represented mysteries that would demand answers. The legend of Captain Elena Vasquez was about to emerge from the shadows, and the consequences would extend far beyond the boundaries of Fort Riverside. The silence that followed Sarah's intervention stretched across the training facility like a physical force, broken only by the distant sounds of other exercises continuing in blissful ignorance of the seismic shift that had just occurred on Charlie Range. Thompson was the first to recover his composure, his decades of military experience providing the framework necessary to process what had just transpired while maintaining the operational security that the situation now demanded. His voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who understood that the next few minutes would determine whether a carefully planned intelligence operation could be salvaged or whether years of preparation would be lost due to circumstances beyond anyone's control. Matthews stood motionless, his rifle still in his hands but forgotten as his mind struggled to reconcile the transformation he had just witnessed with everything he thought he knew about the woman who had been the target of his condescension for the past 6 weeks. The fluid precision of her movements, the instantaneous tactical assessment that had prevented a potentially catastrophic accident, and the unmistakable air of lethal competence that now surrounded her were impossible to reconcile with the struggling recruit he had been mocking since her arrival at Fort Riverside. His worldview, built on assumptions about physical capability and military competence, was crumbling in real time as he confronted evidence that fundamentally challenged everything he believed about strength, age, and the nature of true professional skill. Brooks felt his legs trembling as the adrenaline from witnessing the near accident combined with the shock of realizing that his assessment of Sarah's capabilities had been not just wrong, but catastrophically misinformed. His athletic background had given him confidence in his ability to evaluate physical performance and tactical competence, but the demonstration he had just witnessed operated on a level that transcended anything he had previously encountered. The woman who had struggled to complete basic obstacle courses had just moved with a speed and precision that suggested training and experience far beyond anything that conventional military service could provide. Walsh remained frozen in the position where Sarah's intervention had left him, his face pale with the understanding that he had been seconds away from creating a tragedy that would have haunted him for the rest of his life. The near accident had been entirely his fault, a result of disorientation and inexperience that could have cost him his military career and potentially injured or killed fellow recruits. The fact that his salvation had come from the person he had consistently dismissed as incompetent added layers of shame and confusion to an already overwhelming emotional experience. Rodriguez found himself reevaluating not just his assessment of Sarah's capabilities, but his entire understanding of what it meant to be a professional soldier. His construction background had taught him to recognize competence when he saw it, and what he had just witnessed represented a level of professional skill that existed in an entirely different category from anything he had previously encountered. The precision of her movements, the instantaneous decision-making under pressure, and the complete absence of wasted motion spoke to training and experience that belonged in special operations units rather than basic recruit training. Foster watched with a mixture of awe and vindication as the woman, who had consistently shown her kindness and encouragement, revealed capabilities that exceeded everyone's most ambitious expectations. Her intuitive sense that Sarah possessed hidden depths had been confirmed in the most dramatic way possible, though the extent of those capabilities far exceeded anything she had imagined. The realization that she had been receiving mentorship from someone of this caliber was both thrilling and intimidating, as it suggested possibilities for her own military career that she had never dared to consider. Thompson's mind was racing through the implications of Sarah's blown cover for Operation looking glass in the larger investigation into equipment procurement fraud that had brought her to Fort Riverside. The careful balance between maintaining operational security and gathering the evidence necessary to expose the Hamilton defense contractors' conspiracy had just been shattered by circumstances that no operational planning could have anticipated. Years of preparation and resource investment were now at risk, though the immediate priority had to be managing the situation to prevent further compromise of classified information and personnel. The challenge facing Thompson was unprecedented in his experience: how to contain the security implications of a blown intelligence operation while maintaining the trust and cooperation of recruits, who now understood that they had been deceived about the true nature of their training environment. The presence of an undercover operative among basic training recruits violated numerous protocols and created legal and ethical complications that extended far beyond his authority to resolve. Higher-level decision-makers would need to be notified immediately, but the immediate tactical situation required his personal management to prevent further escalation. Sarah herself stood in the center of the gathering storm, with the calm that came from years of operating in situations where careful planning had given way to dynamic crisis management. Her cover identity was irretrievably compromised, but the mission objectives that had brought her to Fort Riverside remained valid and important. The evidence she had gathered about equipment fraud and contractor corruption could still serve justice for soldiers who had died due to defective gear, even if the methods of gathering that evidence would now need to be completely reconsidered. The transformation from struggling recruit to revealed operative had been so complete that it seemed to physically alter her appearance in ways that transcended simple changes in posture and bearing. The gray streaks in her hair now seemed like camouflage rather than signs of aging. Her weathered hands appeared to be tools shaped by professional use rather than evidence of hard living, and her eyes carried the unmistakable depth that came from seeing too much of the world's darkness while maintaining the moral clarity necessary to fight against it. Matthews was the first to find his voice, though the words came out as barely more than a whisper. "Who are you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, carrying not just curiosity but a demand for truth that reflected his growing understanding that everything he thought he knew about their training environment had been built on deception. His worldview required clear categories and defined hierarchies, and Sarah's transformation had shattered those comfortable certainties in ways that demanded immediate reconstruction. Sarah's response was delivered with the quiet authority that had once made her legendary among special operations communities worldwide. "My name is Captain Elena Vasquez," she said, her voice carrying across the range with perfect clarity. "My call sign is Sniper 1, and I've been operating under deep cover to investigate equipment procurement fraud that has cost American soldiers their lives." The simple statement contained implications that would require hours of explanation to fully process, but the immediate impact was to establish her credibility and authority in terms that every military professional could understand and respect. The revelation of her true identity and rank sent shockwaves through the assembled recruits that transcended simple surprise and entered the realm of fundamental worldview disruption. Sniper 1 was not just a call sign but a legend within military circles, representing the pinnacle of marksmanship achievement and tactical competence. Stories about the operator who carried that designation had circulated through military communities for years, though the details were often classified and the identity of the person behind the legend had been carefully protected by operational security requirements. Thompson's confirmation of her identity carried the weight of official authentication that transformed speculation into verified fact. Captain Vasquez holds the record for the longest confirmed sniper kill in Afghanistan. He announced, his voice carrying the respect that such an achievement demanded. She has been decorated for valor on 3 separate occasions and has served with distinction in every major theater of operations over the past 2 decades. Her presence here represents the highest levels of national security priority. The implications of Thompson's announcement extended far beyond simple biographical information, as it established that their training environment had been hosting an intelligence operation of national significance. The struggling recruit they had been dismissing and mocking was actually one of the most accomplished soldiers in the United States Army, operating undercover to investigate crimes that threatened the safety and effectiveness of military operations worldwide. The casual cruelty they had displayed toward her now appeared not just as personal failures of character, but as obstacles to national security objectives. Matthews felt his carefully constructed self-image crumbling as he confronted the reality that his judgment and leadership had been not just wrong but actively harmful to someone whose service and sacrifice exceeded his most ambitious aspirations. The confidence that had defined his identity throughout basic training was replaced by shame and confusion as he struggled to process the magnitude of his misjudgment. Everything he had said and done regarding Sarah now appeared in a completely different light, revealing character flaws and prejudices that he had been unaware of possessing. The social dynamics that had governed the platoon for weeks were instantly and permanently altered as power relationships shifted to accommodate the new reality of Elena's true identity and capabilities. The informal hierarchy that had placed Matthews at the top and Sarah at the bottom was not just reversed, but revealed to have been based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about competence, experience, and the nature of military excellence. The recruits who had participated in mocking her now found themselves in the position of having insulted one of the most respected soldiers in the Army. Elena's next words carried implications that extended far beyond personal vindication, as she began to explain the larger context that had brought her to Fort Riverside and the stakes involved in the investigation she had been conducting. The equipment procurement fraud I've been investigating has resulted in the deaths of at least 12 American soldiers over the past 3 years, she announced, her voice carrying the weight of personal responsibility for seeking justice on behalf of the fallen. Hamilton Defense Contractors has been selling defective gear to the military while bribing Pentagon officials to suppress quality control reports that would have prevented those deaths. The revelation of the conspiracy behind her undercover operation provided context that transformed her blown cover from a tactical setback into a potential catalyst for achieving justice that had been delayed too long. The evidence she had gathered during her time at Fort Riverside, combined with documentation from other sources, could expose corruption that reached the highest levels of military procurement and contractor oversight. The personal cost of her revealed identity might be offset by the opportunity to finally bring accountability to those responsible for preventable military casualties. Thompson's role in the operation was now revealed as significantly more complex than his apparent function as a drill sergeant, as he began coordinating communications with higher-level command authorities, who would need to be immediately notified about the compromise of operational security. His knowledge of Elena's true identity had been part of the operational planning from the beginning, making him both a witness to her extraordinary performance and a guardian of secrets that could affect national security if improperly disclosed. The technical aspects of managing a blown intelligence operation required immediate attention to prevent further compromise of classified information and personnel. Elena's true identity would need to be protected from unauthorized disclosure while allowing sufficient transparency to maintain the trust and cooperation of recruits who now understood that their training environment had been hosting activities beyond their security clearance levels. The balance between operational security and institutional credibility would require careful management by officials far above Thompson's pay grade. Elena's explanation of the Hamilton Defense Contractors conspiracy provided the recruits with their first understanding of the stakes involved in the investigation that had brought her to Fort Riverside. The company had been systematically defrauding the military by substituting inferior materials and critical equipment while maintaining the appearance of compliance with stringent quality standards. Body armor that failed to stop standard ammunition, communication equipment that malfunctioned under combat conditions, and vehicle components that failed prematurely had all contributed to unnecessary casualties that could have been prevented with proper oversight. The scope of the conspiracy extended beyond simple contractor fraud to include bribery and corruption within Pentagon procurement offices that were responsible for ensuring equipment quality and safety. High-ranking officials had been receiving payments and other benefits in exchange for suppressing quality control reports and expediting approval processes for equipment that did not meet military specifications. The systematic nature of the corruption had made it virtually impossible to expose through conventional oversight mechanisms, requiring the kind of deep cover investigation that Elena had been conducting. Matthews struggled to process the implications of Elena's revelation for his own understanding of military service and the institutional trust that he had always taken for granted. The idea that American soldiers had been betrayed by their own procurement system challenged fundamental assumptions about military professionalism and the protective relationship between the institution and the individuals who served within it. His hero worship of military excellence was complicated by the understanding that excellence sometimes required fighting against the very system that was supposed to support and protect those who served. The evidence that Elena had gathered during her time at Fort Riverside included documentation of equipment failures, financial records showing improper payments, and recorded conversations with individuals involved in the conspiracy. The blown cover that now seemed like a catastrophic operational failure might actually provide the perfect opportunity to transition from covert evidence gathering to overt legal action that could finally bring justice to those responsible for the preventable deaths of American soldiers. The transformation of the training exercise from a routine assessment to a moment of national security significance required immediate adjustments to protocols and procedures that had not been designed to accommodate such extraordinary circumstances. Elena's revealed identity would need to be protected while allowing her to fulfill her responsibilities as both a commissioned officer and an intelligence operative whose mission remained incomplete. The recruits who had witnessed her transformation would need to be briefed on security requirements while maintaining their trust and institutional integrity. Foster found herself overwhelmed by the understanding that her intuitive respect for Elena had been vindicated in ways that exceeded her most ambitious imagination. The woman who had consistently shown her kindness and encouragement was actually a legendary figure whose service and sacrifice represented the highest ideals of military excellence. The realization that she had been receiving mentorship from someone of this caliber provided both inspiration and intimidation as she considered the possibilities for her own military career. Elena's final words to the assembled recruits carried the weight of both personal revelation and professional responsibility as she prepared to transition from her undercover role to whatever would come next in the investigation that had consumed years of her life. The soldiers who died because of defective equipment deserved better than the system that failed them, she said, her voice carrying the conviction that had sustained her through the isolation and deception required by her cover identity. Their families deserve the truth about why they died, and the American people deserve to know that their military is free from the corruption that puts our soldiers at unnecessary risk. The immediate future would require Elena to work with military prosecutors and congressional investigators to ensure that the evidence she had gathered could be used effectively to bring justice to those responsible for the conspiracy. Her blown cover would necessitate new security measures to protect her from retaliation by those whose crime she was exposing, but it would also allow her to testify openly about what she had discovered and advocate directly for the institutional reforms necessary to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The recruits who had witnessed her transformation would carry the memory of this moment throughout their military careers, understanding that true military excellence sometimes required the courage to challenge institutional failures and fight for justice on behalf of those who could no longer speak for themselves. The legend of Sniper 1 had emerged from the shadows not to claim personal glory, but to ensure that the sacrifice of fallen soldiers would lead to the accountability and reform necessary to protect future generations of American military personnel. As Elena prepared to leave Fort Riverside for the final phase of an investigation that had consumed years of her life, she reflected on the personal cost of maintaining a cover identity that had required her to endure mockery and dismissal from people she was sworn to protect. The mission had succeeded in gathering the evidence necessary to expose corruption and seek justice for preventable deaths, but the psychological toll of living as someone else while suppressing her true capabilities and identity would require time and support to fully process and overcome. The story of the recruit who had been mocked for her age would become legend within military communities, not just for the dramatic revelation of her true identity, but for the larger message about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize the hidden depths that people carried with them. Elena's service would continue in new forms as she worked to ensure that the conspiracy she had exposed would lead to meaningful reforms that honored the memory of those who had died and protected those who would serve in the future. The Pentagon's secure conference room hummed with the tension of high-stakes decision-making as General Robert Chun reviewed the classified files spread across the mahogany table before him. 3 months had passed since the Fort Riverside incident that had blown Elena's cover, and the investigation into Hamilton Defense Contractors had evolved from a covert intelligence operation into a full-scale federal prosecution that threatened to expose corruption reaching the highest levels of military leadership. The evidence Elena had gathered during her undercover assignment had provided the foundation for what would become the largest defense contractor fraud case in American history. Chun himself was among those whose careers hung in the balance, as his signature appeared on numerous procurement documents that had approved Hamilton's defective equipment, despite quality control reports that should have triggered immediate investigation. His involvement had been carefully concealed through layers of bureaucratic complexity designed to obscure accountability, but Elena's documentation had methodically traced the decision-making process back to its sources. The general who had once wielded enormous influence over military procurement decisions now found himself facing potential court-martial proceedings that could end his career and result in federal prison time. The scope of Hamilton Defense Contractors' fraud had proven even more extensive than Elena's initial investigation had suggested, with forensic accountants discovering a pattern of systematic deception that had persisted for over 7 years. The company had developed sophisticated methods for substituting inferior materials, while maintaining the appearance of compliance with military specifications, using bribery and corruption to ensure that quality control failures were suppressed before they could trigger broader investigations. The financial magnitude of the fraud exceeded $2 billion in federal contracts, while the human cost included the deaths of 23 American soldiers whose protective equipment had failed under combat conditions. Elena stood before the Senate Armed Services Committee as the morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Hart Senate Office Building, her dress uniform bearing the decorations that testified to decades of distinguished service in the most challenging environments the military could offer. The transformation from struggling recruit to celebrated hero had been documented extensively by media organizations that had turned her story into a symbol of individual courage standing against institutional corruption. Her testimony would provide the authoritative account that prosecutors needed to secure convictions against the highest-level defendants in the Hamilton conspiracy. Senator Patricia Williams, the committee chairwoman, called the hearing to order with the gravity appropriate to proceedings that would determine whether American military personnel could trust the equipment their lives depended upon. The packed gallery included family members of soldiers who had been killed by defective Hamilton equipment, military personnel whose careers had been damaged by attempting to report quality control failures, and representatives from defense contractors who understood that the outcome of these proceedings would reshape their entire industry. Elena's opening statement carried the moral authority that came from personal sacrifice in service of larger principles, as she detailed the investigation that had required her to suppress her identity and endure mockery while gathering evidence that could save future lives. Her voice remained steady as she described the emotional cost of maintaining her cover while watching fellow recruits struggle with training challenges that she could have easily resolved, knowing that revealing her capabilities would compromise a mission that could prevent other families from experiencing the loss that Hamilton's fraud had inflicted on military families across the country. The technical details of Elena's testimony provided the committee with a comprehensive understanding of how Hamilton had systematically defrauded the military through carefully orchestrated schemes that exploited weaknesses in procurement oversight. Body armor that failed ballistic testing had been approved through falsified documentation. Communication equipment that malfunctioned under field conditions had been delivered with fraudulent quality certifications, and vehicle components that failed prematurely had been accepted despite inspection reports that should have triggered immediate rejection. Matthews sat in the gallery with the other Fort Riverside recruits who had been granted security clearances, allowing them to attend the classified portions of Elena's testimony, his face reflecting the ongoing process of reconciling his prejudices with the reality of Elena's service and sacrifice. The weeks following the blown cover incident had provided time for reflection that had fundamentally altered his understanding of leadership, competence, and the dangers of making judgments based on superficial characteristics rather than substantive evidence of capability and character. The personal transformation that Matthews had undergone since learning Elena's true identity extended beyond simple embarrassment about his previous behavior to encompass a deeper understanding of the responsibilities that came with military leadership. His natural charisma and physical capabilities had always made leadership roles seem effortless, but Elena's example had taught him that true leadership sometimes required the humility to acknowledge mistakes and the wisdom to learn from those who possessed greater experience and knowledge regardless of their apparent status or position. Foster had been personally recruited by Elena to serve as a character witness during the proceedings, her testimony providing insight into the psychological pressures that Elena had endured while maintaining her cover identity among recruits who had no understanding of her true background. Foster's description of Elena's consistent kindness and encouragement, despite the mockery she endured, highlighted the personal cost of the investigation and the moral character that had sustained her through months of isolation and deception. The evidence presentation required multiple days of testimony as prosecutors methodically documented the full scope of Hamilton's fraud and the network of corruption that had enabled it to persist for years without detection. Financial records showed millions of dollars in improper payments to Pentagon officials, while quality control documents revealed systematic suppression of safety concerns that could have prevented military casualties. The complexity of the conspiracy required expert witnesses to explain technical aspects of equipment, testing, and procurement procedures to committee members whose expertise lay in policy rather than engineering. General Chun's appearance before the committee represented the climax of the accountability process, as his testimony would determine whether the corruption had been limited to lower-level officials or extended to the senior leadership responsible for overseeing military procurement. His initial attempts to claim ignorance of Hamilton's fraudulent activities were systematically dismantled by prosecutors who presented email communications, meeting minutes, and financial records that documented his active participation in decisions that prioritized contractor profits over soldier safety. The cross-examination of Chun revealed the institutional pressures that had contributed to the corruption, including performance metrics that rewarded cost savings and procurement speed, while providing insufficient incentives for quality assurance and safety verification. The general's career had been built on achieving bureaucratic objectives that looked impressive in budget presentations, but failed to account for the downstream consequences of accepting substandard equipment that would be used in life or death situations by soldiers who had no knowledge of the compromises being made on their behalf. Elena's detailed reconstruction of the investigation process provided the committee with insight into the sophisticated methods required to penetrate a conspiracy that had been carefully designed to resist detection through conventional oversight mechanisms. Her ability to maintain operational security while gathering evidence in a high-surveillance environment demonstrated the level of professional competence that had made her legendary within special operations communities, while her willingness to sacrifice her cover to prevent a training accident showed the moral principles that guided her decision-making under pressure. The emotional climax of Elena's testimony came when she read the names of soldiers who had been killed by Hamilton's defective equipment, personalizing the consequences of corporate fraud and official corruption in terms that transcended abstract discussions of procurement policy and regulatory compliance. Each name represented a family that had been told their loved one died serving their country, without understanding that preventable equipment failures had contributed to losses that proper oversight could have avoided. The committee's final report would establish new standards for defense contractor oversight that included independent testing requirements, whistleblower protections for military personnel who reported quality concerns, and criminal penalties for officials who accepted bribes or suppressed safety information. Elena's investigation had not only exposed a specific conspiracy, but it also revealed systemic weaknesses that required comprehensive reform to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. The legal proceedings that followed the congressional hearings resulted in convictions for all major participants in the Hamilton conspiracy, with sentences ranging from substantial financial penalties for lower-level participants to decades in federal prison for those who bore primary responsibility for decisions that had cost soldiers their lives. The company itself was dissolved and its assets liquidated to provide compensation for victims' families, while the individuals responsible for the fraud were permanently barred from involvement in government contracting. Elena's personal vindication extended beyond the successful prosecution of those responsible for the conspiracy to include recognition of her extraordinary service through awards and commendations that acknowledged both her investigative work and her decades of distinguished military service. The Presidential Medal of Freedom she received represented not just personal achievement, but also recognition of the principle that individual courage could still triumph over institutional corruption when guided by moral clarity and sustained by professional competence. The Fort Riverside recruits who had witnessed Elena's transformation completed their basic training with a deeper understanding of military values and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize the true measure of character and competence. Matthews graduated as the honor recruit of his class, but his speech emphasized the lessons he had learned about humility and the dangers of prejudgment, rather than celebrating his own achievements. His future military career would be shaped by Elena's example of service that prioritized mission, accomplishment, and troop welfare over personal recognition or advancement. Foster received an appointment to West Point, partially based on Elena's recommendation, beginning a military career that would be guided by the mentorship she had received from someone whose service represented the highest ideals of military professionalism. Her understanding of leadership had been shaped by observing Elena's ability to maintain mission focus while enduring personal hardship, providing a foundation for decision-making that would serve her throughout a career dedicated to protecting and serving others. The institutional reforms that resulted from Elena's investigation created new mechanisms for ensuring equipment, quality, and accountability that would protect future generations of military personnel from the kind of betrayal that Hamilton's conspiracy had represented. Independent testing laboratories, enhanced whistleblower protections, and criminal penalties for procurement fraud established, safeguards that made similar conspiracies far more difficult to initiate and sustain without detection. Elena's transition from undercover operative to public advocate for military personnel safety marked a new chapter in a career that had already spanned multiple decades of distinguished service in various capacities. Her expertise in identifying and investigating institutional corruption made her an invaluable resource for oversight organizations and congressional committees responsible for ensuring that military procurement served the interests of soldiers, rather than corporate profits or bureaucratic convenience. The personal cost of Elena's investigation had included not just the psychological strain of maintaining a false identity, but also the physical and emotional toll of suppressing her natural responses and capabilities for months while enduring treatment that contradicted everything she had earned through decades of exemplary service. The support she received from fellow veterans and military families helped her process the trauma of the experience while maintaining focus on the larger objectives that had made her sacrifice worthwhile. The media attention that surrounded Elena's story had transformed her into a symbol of individual integrity standing against institutional corruption, but she consistently redirected public focus toward the soldiers who had died due to equipment failures and the systemic reforms necessary to prevent similar tragedies. Her public appearances emphasized accountability and prevention rather than personal recognition, reflecting the same values that had guided her decision to accept the undercover assignment despite its personal costs. The Hamilton Defense Contractors case established precedents for prosecuting defense contractor fraud that would deter similar conspiracies while providing legal frameworks for future investigations. The successful prosecution demonstrated that even sophisticated conspiracies involving high-level corruption could be exposed and defeated when confronted by investigators willing to make personal sacrifices in service of justice and accountability. Elena's legacy extended beyond the specific conspiracy she had exposed to encompass broader questions about civil-military relations, the responsibilities of military professionals, and the importance of maintaining institutional integrity in organizations whose failures could cost lives. Her example provided inspiration for other military personnel who faced ethical dilemmas, requiring them to choose between personal advancement and professional obligations to protect and serve others. The families of soldiers who had been killed by Hamilton's defective equipment finally received both the truth about their loved ones' deaths and compensation that acknowledged the preventable nature of their losses. The closure provided by Elena's investigation could not restore their family members, but it could ensure that their deaths contributed to reforms that would protect other military families from experiencing similar tragedies due to corporate greed and official corruption. Elena's story became part of military folklore, inspiring future generations of soldiers to maintain ethical standards and professional competence regardless of personal cost or institutional pressure. The legend of Sniper 1 evolved beyond marksmanship excellence to encompass moral courage and dedication to principles that transcended individual career advancement or personal recognition. The long-term impact of Elena's investigation would be measured not just in prosecutions and policy changes, but in the restoration of trust between military personnel and the institutions responsible for providing them with equipment that met the highest standards of quality and reliability. Her sacrifice had demonstrated that individual action could still make a difference in large institutions, providing hope for others who face similar ethical challenges in their professional lives. As Elena accepted her final military decoration in a ceremony attended by the families of soldiers whose lives had been lost to preventable equipment failures, she reflected on a career that had evolved from conventional military service to intelligence operations to public advocacy for institutional reform. The personal cost had been substantial, but the knowledge that her work would protect future generations of American military Personnel provided the satisfaction that came from service that had made a lasting difference in the lives of others. The standing ovation that concluded the ceremony reflected not just recognition of Elena's individual achievements, but also acknowledgement of the principles she had represented throughout a career dedicated to protecting those who could not protect themselves. Her transformation from struggling recruit to vindicated hero demonstrated the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize the true measure of character and the potential for individual action to create meaningful change, even the largest and most complex institutions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.